Nyra Solis was the city's hidden pulse of light, a woman of petals and grace who found strength in gentleness. She believed she was merely a florist, unaware that her very blood held the secrets to an empire. Zayden Sterling was the abyss that hungered for her. To him, Nyra wasn't just a woman. She was a fever, a haunting obsession that blurred the line between protection and possession. He was a predator who didn't know how to love without crushing, yet he was willing to burn the world to ashes just to keep her within his shadow. She was his salvation. He was her beautiful destruction. And in the heart of a rain-soaked Seattle, their collision would rewrite the fate of the underworld. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it punished. It was a relentless, vertical ocean that blurred the neon signs of the docks into bleeding smears of crimson and electric blue. Nyra Solis pulled her thin cardigan tighter, but it was a useless gesture. The fabric was soaked through, clinging to her skin like a second, freezing layer of despair. Her lungs burned with every breath of the icy night air, the mist swirling around her like ghostly fingers. Behind her, the rhythmic, heavy thud of combat boots on wet pavement echoed through the narrow alleyway. They were gaining on her. "Find her! Thorn wants her alive, but he didn't say anything about her being unharmed," a gravelly voice barked, the sound bouncing off the brick walls. Nyra's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. Just 12 hours ago, her biggest worry had been a wilting shipment of peonies at her small flower shop. But then the men in black suits had arrived, not with a floral order, but with a ledger. Her father's gambling debts had finally come due, and the currency Caliph Thorn demanded wasn't money. It was her. Her father had disappeared, leaving her as the collateral for a debt written in blood. She burst out of the alley and onto a rain-slicked main road. Her vision was a chaotic mess of salt and water. The street was nearly empty, save for a line of black luxury vehicles idling near the curb, their tail guards glowing like the eyes of predators in the dark. At the very front sat a beast of a machine, a matte black SUV with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows that looked like they could withstand a tank shell. It stood out from the others, exuding an aura of cold, silent authority. Without thinking, driven by pure, primal survival instinct, Nyra lunged for the rear door handle. She expected it to be locked. She expected to be dragged away by Thorn's men right then and there. But to her shock, the handle clicked. The lock was open. She scrambled inside, tumbling onto the plush leather floorboards just as a bullet shattered the brickwork of the building she had stood next to a second ago. She slammed the door shut, the heavy thud sealing out the chaos of the world. Silence. The interior of the car was a stark contrast to the freezing hell outside. It smelled of expensive sandalwood, aged whiskey, and something metallic, like the sharpened edge of a blade. The air was thick, heavy with a tension that made the hair on the back of Nyra's neck stand up. I'm so sorry," Nyra gasped, her chest heaving, her vision blurred by the rain dripping from her hair onto the pristine carpet. "Please, just drive. Please, there are men. They're trying to kill me." She looked up, expecting to see a startled driver. Instead, she met a pair of eyes that were colder than the rain. In the back seat, inches away from her, sat a man who looked like he had been carved out of obsidian. His hair was black as a raven's wing, swept back to reveal a face of brutal, aristocratic perfection. High cheekbones, a straight, cruel nose, and a jawline that could cut glass. But it was his eyes, a piercing, metallic silver, that froze the blood in her veins. This was Zayden Sterling. Even a florist living a quiet life knew that name. He was the king of the underworld, the ghost that moved the city's gears, the man who owned the shadows everyone else feared. To sit in his car was to sit in the mouth of a volcano. Zayden didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. He merely tilted his head, watching her with the detached curiosity of a predator observing a wounded fawn that had accidentally wandered into its den. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, the ice clinking softly against the glass. "You have 10 seconds to give me a reason not to throw you back to them," Zayden said. His voice was a low, melodic growl, smooth as silk, yet dangerous as a razor pressed against a throat. I have nothing," Nyra whispered, her voice trembling so hard she could barely form the words. "But if you let me stay, I'll do anything. Please, they'll kill me." Zayden's silver eyes travelled down her drenched figure, lingering on the way her pulse throbbed frantically in her throat. Outside, the men from Thorne's gang arrived. They saw the vehicle and hesitated for a fraction of a second, recognizing the Sterling crest on the hubcaps. But desperation or stupidity won out. They began pounding on the glass, their faces distorted by the rain and the heavy tint. "Open the door! That girl is Thorne's property!" one of them yelled, reaching for his holster. Zayden didn't even look at the window. He kept his gaze fixed on Nyra. "The men outside belong to Caliph Thorne," he remarked casually, taking a slow sip of his drink. "He is a man who hates to lose his toys. By keeping you here, I'm effectively declaring a war I wasn't planning to fight until next Tuesday." "I'm sorry," Nyra sobbed, closing her eyes and shrinking into the floorboards. "I didn't know whose car this was. I just wanted to live." Zayden reached out a gloved hand. For a moment, she thought he was going to grab her by the hair and hurl her into the street. Instead, he traced the line of her jaw with a single finger. His touch was terrifyingly steady. "Anything?" he repeated, the word tasting like a dark promise on his tongue. "Anything," she breathed, a silent pact made in the dark. Zayden tapped the glass partition, separating the cabin from the driver. "Drive. And Elias?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling." The driver's voice crackled through the intercom, calm and devoid of emotion. "If any of Thorne's dogs follow us, erase them from the map." The SUV lurched forward, its powerful engine roaring like a caged beast finally being unleashed. Nyra felt the centrifugal force push her against the expensive leather seat. She watched through the rear window as the men who had been hunting her became smaller and smaller, eventually swallowed by the darkness and the spray of the tires. For the first time in hours, she breathed. But as she looked at Zayden Sterling, sitting there in his impeccable charcoal suit, she realized the terrifying truth. She hadn't been saved. She had simply changed owners. The car moved through the city like a shark through water. Zayden remained silent for a long time, the only sound being the soft hum of the tires and the rain lashing against the roof. He watched the city lights flicker across Nyra's face, gold, blue, and red. "What is your name, little son?" Zayden asked suddenly. Nyra Solis." "Solis," he mused, a ghost of a cruel smile touching his lips. "The sun, a pity. Because in my world, Nyra, the sun never rises. It only burns out." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy silver coin, flipping it idly between his knuckles. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was hypnotic, rhythmic, like the ticking of a doomsday clock. "My father. He owed Caliph money," Nyra found herself saying, her voice small in the vastness of the car. "I didn't choose this." "None of us choose the blood we are born into," Zayden replied, his eyes turning back to the window. "But we choose what we do with the blood we spill. Your father was a fool. He gambled with a currency he didn't possess. Thorne doesn't want money. He wants to break things that are beautiful just to prove he can." Nyra shivered. And you? What do you want? Zayden turned his head back to her. The silver in his eyes seemed to glow in the dim light of the cabin. He leaned forward, his massive frame looming over her, trapping her between his body and the door. He smelled of rain and power. "I don't want to break you, Nyra," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "I want to own you. There is a difference." The car began to climb a steep hill, leaving the grime of the docks behind for the sprawling estates of the Sterling district. Huge iron gates swung open automatically as the convoy approached, guarded by men with submachine guns who bowed their heads as the black SUV passed. The Sterling Fortress, as the locals called it, was a monolith of glass and black stone perched on the edge of a cliff. It looked less like a home and more like a temple dedicated to an ancient, vengeful god. As the car came to a smooth halt under the grand portico, a valet stepped forward to open the door. Zayden stood up, his height intimidating, his presence filling the entire courtyard. He didn't offer Nyra a hand. He simply expected her to follow. She stepped out of the car, her legs wobbling. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the wind up here was fierce. She looked back at the gates, then up at the dark towers of the mansion. "Welcome to the end of your old life." "Nyra Solis," Zayden said without looking back. He walked towards the massive oak doors, his coat billowing behind him like a cape of shadows. Nyra stood in the rain for a heartbeat, looking at the silver coin Zayden had dropped on the seat. She picked it up. It was cold. She realized then that the mistake she had made, stepping into this car, wasn't just a coincidence. It was the moment her soul had been signed over to the man in the silver light. She followed him into the house, the doors closing behind her with a finality that sounded like a tomb being sealed. Inside the foyer was a cathedral of cold marble. A grand staircase spiraled upward like the spine of a giant. Every piece of art on the walls looked like it belonged in a museum or a nightmare. There were paintings of battles, of fallen angels, and of men who looked remarkably like Zayden, all with the same piercing silver stare. An older man in a crisp tuxedo approached. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling. I see you've brought company." "She's not company, Marcus," Zayden said, unbuttoning his jacket and handing it to the butler. "She's a debt. Prepare the East Wing, and call the physician. She's shivering, and I don't want my property falling ill before I've decided what to do with it." Property. The word stung worse than the cold. Nyra stood in the center of the hall, her wet shoes staining the white marble. She felt small, dirty, and utterly out of place. She looked at Zayden, who was already walking away toward a set of double doors that likely led to his office. "Wait!" she called out. Zayden stopped. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed. "In this house, Nyra, you speak when spoken to. That is the first rule." "Thank you," she whispered. Zayden turned then, his expression unreadable. "Don't thank me yet. You might find that Thorne's bullets were the kinder option." With that, he disappeared into the shadows of the house, leaving Nyra alone with Marcus and the deafening silence of the Sterling Fortress. She gripped the silver coin in her pocket until the edges dug into her palm, drawing a tiny drop of blood. The sun had set and the night of Zayden Sterling had truly begun. The east wing of the Sterling Fortress did not feel like a bedroom. It felt like a gallery designed to showcase a captive. As the heavy oak doors drifted shut behind Nyra, the click of the lock echoing like a gavel, she stood frozen on a rug that felt soft enough to be made of clouds. The room was vast, dominated by a four-poster bed draped in charcoal silk. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the jagged cliffs of the Pacific Northwest, where the ocean churned in a violent shade of midnight blue. Nyra walked towards the glass, her reflection staring back at her. She looked like a ghost, pale, drenched, and hollow-eyed. She pressed a hand against the pane. The glass was thick, reinforced, cold. It was a beautiful view of a world she was no longer allowed to touch. "The bath is drawn, Miss Solis." Nyra jumped, spinning around to find a young woman standing near a hidden door in the paneling. She was dressed in a sharp, monochromatic uniform, her face a mask of professional indifference. "Who are you?" Nyra asked, her voice cracking. "I am Ilara. I have been assigned to your care," the girl replied, stepping forward to take Nyra's wet cardigan. "Mr. Sterling does not like disorder. Your clothes have been disposed of. New ones are in the dressing room. All of them are in your size." "My size? How could he possibly know my size?" Ilara offered a small, chilling smile. "Mr. Sterling knows the exact dimensions of everything he owns. Please, the water is getting cold." Nyra allowed herself to be led into a bathroom of white marble and gold fixtures. The tub was large enough to be a swimming pool, filled with steaming water that smelled of jasmine and expensive oils. As she sank into the heat, the physical chill finally began to leave her bones, but the mental frost remained. She thought of her father. Was he alive? Was he the one who told Zayden about her? Or was she truly just a random victim of a silver mistake? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Zayden's silver gaze. Not the eyes of a man, but the eyes of a storm. After the bath, she found the dressing room filled with garments that cost more than her flower shop's annual lease. She chose a simple, long-sleeved silk dress in a deep emerald green. It felt like liquid against her skin, a mockery of the rough denim she usually wore. A knock sounded at the door. It wasn't Ilara. The knock was heavy, rhythmic, and carried an air of command. Nyra's heart skipped. "Come in." The door opened and Zayden Sterling stepped into the room. He had changed into a black turtleneck and tailored trousers. Without the suit jacket, his physical presence was even more overwhelming. His shoulders were broad, his movements fluid and predatory. He carried a small velvet box in his hand. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, surveying her. The emerald silk clung to her curves, and for a brief second she saw a flicker of something dark and hungry in his silver eyes, before he masked it with cold indifference. "Emerald suits you," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in the very air. "It reminds me of the woods before a fire." "Where is my father?" Nyra demanded, finding a spark of courage in her desperation. Zayden walked toward her, stopping only when he was inches away. He smelled of smoke and something expensive. "Your father is a ghost, Nyra. He fled the city the moment he realized Thorn wouldn't accept a grace period. He left you to the wolves. It was only by my grace that you found a lion instead." "You're not a lion," Nyra whispered, looking up at him. "You're a jailer." Zayden laughed, a short, dry sound that lacked any warmth. "In this world, everyone is a jailer or a prisoner. I simply prefer to hold the keys." He opened the velvet box. Inside was a choker made of black silk, featuring a single, teardrop-shaped diamond the color of a storm cloud. He reached out, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of her neck, as he moved to put it on her. Nyra flinched, pulling back. "I don't want your jewelry." Zayden's hand moved with lightning speed, gripping her chin and tilting her head up. His touch wasn't painful, but it was absolute. "This isn't a gift, Nyra. It's a marker. It tells everyone in this house and everyone in this city that you are under the protection of the Sterling crest. Without it, you are just another piece of trash that Thorn can pick up." He fastened the choker. The diamond rested right against her pulse point, cold and heavy. "Why me?" she asked, her breath hitching. "You could have any woman. You have power, money, everything. Why keep a florist from the docks? Zayden leaned in, his lips inches from her ear. Because you didn't scream when the bullets flew. You chose to jump into the dark rather than be caught in the light. That kind of instinct is rare, and because— He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips. I find that I enjoy the way you look in my house. You are the only bright thing in this tomb. He stepped back, the tension in the room breaking slightly. Dinner is served in 10 minutes. Marcus will escort you. Do not be late. I despise tardiness as much as I despise betrayal. As he turned to leave, Nyra called out, What happens if I try to leave? Zayden stopped at the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. The moonlight caught the silver in his eyes, making them look metallic. The gates are electrified. The dogs are trained to kill. And even if you made it to the road, Thorn is waiting in the shadows. You can leave whenever you like, Nyra, but you won't survive the first mile. The door closed, leaving her alone in her emerald silk and black diamond. Dinner was a silent, agonizing affair in a dining hall that could have seated 50 people. They sat at opposite ends of a long mahogany table, the space between them filled with the flickering shadows of candelabras. The food was exquisite: Wagyu beef, roasted root vegetables, a wine that tasted like liquid rubies, but Nyra couldn't taste any of it. She watched Zayden. He ate with a terrifying precision, his movements elegant yet imbued with a latent violence. Caliph Thorn called my office an hour ago, Zayden said, breaking the silence as he wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. Nyra dropped her fork. It clattered against the china like a gunshot. What did he say? He offered me a trade, 2 of my shipping routes in exchange for your return. He seems quite obsessed with you. It makes me wonder what else your father stole from him. My father didn't steal anything. He just gambled. Is that what you believe? Zayden leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in his silver eyes. Thorn doesn't trade shipping routes for a gambler's daughter. He trades them for something that can destroy him. Your father was a courier for the Thorn Syndicate for years, Nyra. He knew things, and he clearly told you things. He told me nothing, Nyra cried, her heart racing. I just sell flowers. I fix bouquets for weddings and funerals. I don't know anything about your wars. Zayden studied her for a long, agonizing minute. Perhaps, or perhaps you are the best actress I have ever met. Either way, Thorn believes you have the encryption keys to his offshore ledgers. Until I know the truth, you stay here. Before Nyra could protest, the heavy doors of the dining hall burst open. A man walked in, his face bruised and his breathing ragged. It was one of Zayden's guards. Sir, the guard gasped. Thorn's men. They didn't wait for an answer. They've hit the perimeter at the north gate. They're using explosives. Zayden didn't panic. He didn't even stand up immediately. He finished his wine, set the glass down with a soft clink, and then rose to his full, imposing height. The air in the room suddenly felt like it was charged with electricity. It seems Caliph has lost his patience, Zayden said, his voice deceptively calm. Elias, take Miss Solis to the safe room in the basement. Seal the level. No, Nyra stood up. You can't just lock me away. Zayden walked to her, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head. He forced her to look at him. The walls of this house are 3 feet thick, but Thorn's spite is deeper. Get in the safe room, Nyra. If I die tonight, the safe room will stay sealed for 48 hours before opening a secret exit to the cliffs. Take it and run, but as long as I am breathing, you belong to the shadows of this house. He turned to the guard, his voice turning into a whip. Assemble the strike team. I want Thorn's men hung from the gate by sunrise. No prisoners. As Nyra was hurried out of the room by Elias, she looked back. Zayden was pulling a silver-plated handgun from a drawer in a sideboard. He looked magnificent and monstrous all at once. She was dragged down a flight of stone stairs into the bowels of the fortress. The safe room was a high-tech bunker, filled with monitors showing the perimeter. As the heavy steel door began to hiss shut, Nyra saw the first explosion on the screen, a bloom of orange fire against the rainy night. She was trapped in a golden cage, and the world outside was burning to get in. She sat on the floor, clutching her emerald dress, the black diamond on her neck feeling like a weight that would eventually pull her under. The monitors flickered. On one of the screens, she saw a figure moving through the smoke with a silver gleam in his hand. Zayden. He wasn't just defending his home, he was hunting. Nyra realized then that the silver mistake wasn't just hers. It was Thorne's. He had challenged a man who didn't know how to lose, and she was the prize in the middle of a slaughter. She closed her eyes, the sound of distant gunfire muffled by the thick steel walls, praying for a dawn she wasn't sure she wanted to see. The safe room was an architectural masterpiece of paranoia. It was a cold, sterile box of reinforced titanium and concrete, buried 40 feet beneath the marble floors of the Sterling fortress. On the wall, a bank of 16 monitors flickered with grainy night vision feeds of the estate. Nyra sat on the edge of a sleek grey cot, her fingers digging into the emerald silk of her dress. Every time a distant explosion rocked the foundation of the house, the monitors would jump and her heart would leap into her throat. She watched the screens with a morbid fascination. She saw flashes of muzzle fire near the north gate. She saw shadows moving through the trees, Thorne's men, desperate and reckless. But mostly, she watched the man in the center of the chaos. Zayden Sterling moved through the smoke like a predator born of it. He didn't hide behind walls or take cover like his guards. He moved with a terrifying, calculated rhythm, his silver-plated handgun embarking fire with surgical precision. On the screen, he looked less like a businessman and more like a god of war. He was efficient, he was heartless, and he was doing all of this for a debt she didn't even understand. Suddenly, the screen showing the east corridor went black. Then, the west gate. One by one, the feeds were dying. "Elias," Nyra called out, her voice echoing in the small room. The guard standing by the door didn't turn. He was staring at his radio, his jaw tight. "They've brought a signal jammer, and they've cut the hard lines. Stay quiet, Miss Solis." Minutes turned into an eternity. The silence in the safe room became more suffocating than the noise of the battle. Nyra found herself pacing the small space, the black diamond choker feeling like it was tightening around her neck. Property. The word kept ringing in her head. She was a flower in a bunker, waiting to see which monster would come through the door to claim her. A muffled thud echoed from the ceiling above, then another. It sounded like heavy footsteps, not the frantic pace of a soldier, but the slow, deliberate stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Click. The electronic lock on the safe room door hissed. The red light turned green. Nyra backed away, her heart hammering. "Elias, someone is coming!" The guard drew his weapon, leveling it at the door. The heavy steel slab slid open with a mechanical groan. Zayden Sterling stepped into the room. He was a mess. His black turtleneck was torn at the shoulder, stained with a mixture of rain and something darker. A thin trail of blood ran down his temple, stark against his pale, aristocratic skin. His silver eyes were blown wide, glowing with a manic, lethal energy. "Sir, is the perimeter secure?" Elias asked, lowering his gun. "Secure enough," Zayden rasped. His voice was raw, as if he'd been shouting over the roar of gunfire. He looked at Nyra, his gaze scanning her from head to toe, ensuring she was still in the emerald dress, still wearing his diamond. "Thorne sent a suicide squad. They weren't meant to win. They were a distraction." "A distraction for what?" Nyra asked, her voice trembling. Zayden didn't answer immediately. He walked toward her, his presence radiating heat and the acrid scent of gunpowder. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of parchment, a physical letter, in an age of digital shadows. He tossed it onto the cot. While his men were dying at my gate, a courier delivered this to my private terminal. Thorn doesn't want you, Nyra. He wants what is buried inside you. Nyra picked up the paper with shaking hands. The handwriting was frantic, messy, but she recognized it instantly. It was her father's. To the one who holds my daughter, the Solis ledger isn't a book. It's a memory. Nyra is the key. Tell her to remember the night of the Black Lilies. If she lives, the empire falls. Julian. The room seemed to tilt. Nyra felt the blood drain from her face. The night of the Black Lilies? I don't know what that means. My father is insane. He's always been a dreamer, a man who lived in stories. Zayden grabbed her upper arms, his grip firm but not crushing. He forced her to look him in the eye. Don't lie to me, little son. Not now. Thorn just sacrificed 30 of his best men just to send a message. He believes you have a memory, a code, a location, a name that can dismantle his entire offshore network. The Solis ledger is the holy grail of the underworld, and it's locked in that pretty head of yours. I don't know anything, Nyra screamed, tears finally breaking through. I was 10 years old when he talked about black lilies. It was a bedtime story about a garden that didn't exist. You're all crazy. You're killing people over a fairy tale. Zayden's expression softened, but only by a fraction. He let go of her arms and sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. He slumped onto the cot, the weight of the night finally catching up to him. For the first time, he looked human. He looked tired. The fairy tale just cost me 4 good men tonight, Nyra, he said quietly, staring at the floor. And it's going to cost me a lot more if I don't find out what you know. Thorn won't stop. He will burn this city to the ground to get to you. Nyra watched him. This was the man who had claimed her as property, the man who had killed without blinking. And yet, seeing the blood on his temple, she felt a strange, traitorous pull of empathy. She walked to the small first aid kit, kept in the corner of the safe room. She sat beside him on the cot. Zayden stiffened, his hand instinctively twitching toward his holster. Sit still, she whispered. She soaked a cotton pad in antiseptic and reached up to his temple. Zayden watched her, his silver eyes tracking her every movement. He could have snapped her neck in a heartbeat, but he remained still, allowing her to tend to the wound. As she pressed the pad to his skin, he hissed, his jaw tightening. The King of New York is afraid of a little stinging, she teased, her voice barely a whisper. The King of New York is wondering why his prisoner is helping him, he countered. Because I'm not like you, Nyra said, her eyes focusing on the cut. I don't want anyone to die, not even you. Zayden reached up, his hand closing over hers, stopping her movements. The contrast was startling, her small, flower-stained hand against his large, scarred one. He pulled her hand away from his face, but didn't let go. You are a dangerous creature, Nyra Solis, he murmured. You have the face of an angel and the name of the sun, but you carry a darkness that could destroy us all. Do you have any idea how much power is in that fairy tale of yours? I don't want power, she said, looking into his silver eyes. I just want to go back to my flowers. The flowers are gone, Zayden said, his voice turning cold again. Thorn burned your shop to the ground 20 minutes ago. There is nothing left of your old life. You are in the Sterling world now, and in this world, we don't fix bouquets, we fix problems. Nyra felt a fresh wave of grief, but she didn't sob. Something was hardening inside her. The girl who sold peonies was dying, replaced by someone who had to survive the night. If I give you this Ledger, will you let me go? Zayden stood up, pulling her up with him. He looked down at her, his silhouette blocking out the light of the monitors. He reached out and touched the black diamond at her throat. I am a man of my word, Nyra. If you give me the ledger, I will ensure Thorn never touches you again. I will give you a new name, a new life, and enough money to buy every flower in the world. But will you let me go? She pressed. Zayden leaned in, his nose brushing against hers. The scent of sandalwood and blood was intoxicating. That is the one thing I cannot promise, because even if you are no longer a debt, I don't think I can let someone like you walk away. Before she could respond, his radio crackled. Sir, Thorn is retreating, but he's left a gift at the gates. We need you. Zayden squeezed her hand one last time, a gesture that felt almost like a plea, before turning to the door. Elias, move her to the penthouse level. The safe room is no longer a secret, and get her something to eat. She's going to need her strength for what comes next. As Zayden walked out, Nyra stood in the center of the bunker. She looked at the crumpled letter from her father, the Knight of the Black Lilies. She closed her eyes and tried to remember. She saw a garden under a full moon. She saw her father whispering a sequence of numbers into a flower petal. She saw a man with a ring with a hawk insignia, standing in the shadows. The ledger wasn't a book, it was a memory, and she realized with a jolt of terror that she did know the first part of the code. But as she looked at the heavy door of the safe room, she knew that telling Zayden the truth would be the end of her freedom. Forever. She was no longer just a girl who stepped into the wrong car. She was the most valuable asset in the world, and she was trapped in a castle made of silver and blood. The move to the penthouse was a blur of armed guards and high-speed elevators. The penthouse was even more luxurious than the East Wing, a glass box suspended in the clouds. But to Nyra, it was just a higher cage. She stood by the window, watching the smoke rise from the city below. Somewhere down there, her shop was ash. Her father was a ghost, and her only ally was a man who wanted to own her soul. She touched the black silk of the choker. Zayden had called her Little Sun. She wondered if he knew that the sun eventually had to set, or if he intended to keep her burning in his sky until there was nothing left of her but cinders. The Black Lilies, she whispered to the empty room. The first sequence came to her. 7, 14, 0, silver. It was a bank coordinate, or a GPS location. She tucked the memory away deep inside the vault of her mind. She wouldn't give it to him yet. Not until she knew if Zayden Sterling was the man who would save her, or the man who would finally break her. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the Sterling fortress, a different kind of war was beginning. A war of shadows, memories, and a diamond that felt like a collar. The penthouse of the Sterling fortress felt less like a home and more like an observation deck for a god who had grown bored of humanity. The walls were nothing but glass, offering a 360-degree view of the rain-drenched Seattle skyline. Below, the city was a shimmering grid of neon and shadows, a playground where men like Zayden Sterling and Calith Thorn moved their pieces. Nyra Solis stood by the glass, her breath fogging the cold surface. She felt like a specimen in a jar, a rare butterfly pinned to a velvet backing. She had been in the penthouse for 6 hours. In that time, her old life had been systematically erased. A team of silent, efficient women had arrived under Zayden's orders to remove every trace of her past. They had taken her scorched cardigan, her worn-out sneakers, and even the simple silver locket she'd worn since childhood. In their place, they left a wardrobe of silk, cashmere, and lace, all in shades of emerald, silver, and black. Zayden didn't just want her, he wanted to reinvent her. The view is better when you realize everyone down there is beneath you. A voice rumbled from the shadows. Nyra didn't turn. She knew the sound of his footsteps now, the heavy, deliberate rhythm of a man who never had to rush because the world waited for him. Zayden stepped into the light of the skyline. He had showered, the blood and grime of the night's battle gone, replaced by a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate tattoos of thorns and anchors that climbed his forearms. "I don't want them to be beneath me," Nyra whispered. "I just want to be among them again. I want to be invisible." Zayden walked to her, standing so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "Invisibility is a luxury for the dead, Nyra. You carry the Solis ledger. You are currently the brightest star in the underworld. If I let you walk out that door, you wouldn't make it to the end of the block before Thorn's men turned you into a headline." He reached out, his hand sliding around her waist to pull her back against him. Nyra stiffened, but she didn't pull away. There was a terrifying safety in his grip, a realization that the man who could destroy her was the only one preventing everyone else from doing the same. "Tonight is a test," Zayden said, his voice vibrating against her spine. "The Council of Five is meeting. They are the families that control the ports, the blood, and the coin of this coast. They've heard whispers about the girl who jumped into my car. They've heard Thorn is offering a king's ransom for your head." Nyra turned in his arms, her eyes wide. "What are you going to tell them?" "I am going to tell them you are mine," Zayden said, his silver eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "And you are going to help me prove it. If they think you are just a prisoner, they will try to buy you or kill you. But if they think you are my consort, the future of the Sterling line, they will fear you as they fear me." "I can't do that," she gasped. "I'm a florist, Zayden. I don't know how to act like one of you." Zayden's hand moved to her throat, his thumb tracing the edge of the black diamond choker. "Then learn quickly, because Thorn will be there, and he will be looking for a crack in your armor." The council meeting was held in a subterranean ballroom beneath the city's oldest cathedral, a place where the sacred met the profane. Nyra felt the weight of the silver-threaded gown she wore. It was heavy, sleeveless, and cut low enough to be provocative yet high enough to remain regal. Her hair had been styled into a sleek, sharp bun, and her makeup made her eyes look larger, darker, and more haunted. Zayden led her through the massive bronze doors. His hand was clamped firmly on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that left no room for doubt. The room was filled with the smell of expensive cigars, aged scotch, and old money. 4 men and 1 woman sat at a circular table made of obsidian. At the head of the table sat an empty chair, the seat reserved for the Sterlings. As they approached, the conversations died. Every eye in the room turned to Nyra. She felt like she was walking through a den of vipers. "Zayden," a man with a scarred face and an Italian accent, spoke up. This was Lorenzo Valenti, the oldest member of the council. "We heard you found a new pet in the rain." Zayden didn't miss a beat. He pulled out the chair for Nyra, seating her with a grace that felt like a threat. Then he sat beside her, leaning back and resting his arm over the back of her chair. "This is Nyra Solis," Zayden said, his voice projecting through the room like a crack of thunder. "And she is not a pet, Lorenzo. She is the reason Thorn's men are currently being fished out of the harbour." A shadow moved at the far end of the room. A man stepped forward from the gloom. He was thin, with pale skin and eyes that looked like they had never seen the sun. He wore a suit that was too sharp and a smile that was too wide. Caliph Thorn. "The Solis girl," Thorn purred, his voice like sandpaper on velvet. You look much better in silk than you did in that rags and cardigan ensemble you wore when you ran from me, Nyra. Tell me, has Zayden told you about the debt yet? Or has he been too busy playing hero? Nyra's hands shook beneath the table. She felt Zayden's fingers tighten on her shoulder, a silent command to stay calm. The debt is settled, Caliph, Zayden said coldly. She is under my name now. If you have a grievance, you bring it to me, not to her. I have a grievance, Thorn said, leaning over the table, his eyes fixed on Nyra. That girl's father stole something that belongs to me, a ledger, a memory, and I want it back. I'm prepared to offer the council a 10% increase in port revenue if Sterling hands her over tonight. The room erupted in whispers. 10% was a fortune. Nyra looked at the other council members. She saw the greed in their eyes. They weren't looking at a woman. They were looking at a ledger. Zayden stood up. The movement was so sudden and violent that the chair behind him screeched against the floor. He didn't look at the council. He looked at Thorn. My price is higher, Zayden said softly. Oh? Thorn smirked. What could be higher than the ports? Zayden reached down and pulled Nyra up to her feet. He leaned in and kissed her. A deep, searing kiss that was less about affection and more about dominance. It was a brand. When he pulled away, Nyra was breathless, her lips tingling. The price is my wrath, Zayden said, his silver eyes flashing with a terrifying light. If any of you vote to hand her over, I will pull my fleet from the coast. I will freeze every sterling account that funds your businesses, and I will start a war that will leave this city a graveyard. Does anyone else want to discuss the 10%? Silence fell over the ballroom. Even Valenti looked away. No one was willing to lose everything for a girl they didn't know. Thorn's smile vanished. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. You're making a mistake, Sterling. You're choosing a girl over an empire. I am a Sterling, Zayden replied, his voice echoing. I don't choose between them. I take both. He turned and walked Nyra out of the room. The moment they were back in the armored car, the adrenaline that had been keeping Nyra upright vanished. She collapsed into the leather seat, her chest heaving. They were going to sell me, she whispered. They were going to give me to him like a piece of meat. Zayden was staring out the window, his jaw tight. He looked like he wanted to break something. That is the world you live in now, Nyra. Everything has a price. Everyone is looking for a weakness. And am I your weakness? She asked, her voice small. Zayden turned to her. In the dim light of the car, he looked ancient, burdened by the crown he wore. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her lower lip, where his kiss had lingered. You are the first thing I've wanted in 10 years that wasn't a territory or a bank account, he said quietly. And in my world, wanting something is the same as being vulnerable. Thorn knows that now. He'll use it. Then let me go, she pleaded. If I'm a liability, give me the money you promised and let me vanish. Zayden's grip tightened on her chin. His eyes turned dark, the silver replaced by a stormy grey. No, I've gone to war for you twice in 24 hours. You're not a liability anymore, Nyra. You're an investment, and I never let go of my investments. When they returned to the fortress, the tension between them had shifted. It was no longer just fear. It was a simmering, dangerous heat. Nyra went to the window of the penthouse, looking out at the city. She felt the weight of the diamond on her neck. It felt heavier tonight. It felt like a collar that was slowly becoming part of her skin. She heard Zayden pour a drink in the library. She walked to the doorway, watching him. He had stripped off his dress shirt and was sitting in his undershirt, the scars on his back visible in the lamplight. He looked exhausted. The night of the black lilies, she said. Zayden froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He turned slowly. You remembered something. It wasn't just a story, Nyra said, walking into the room. My father took me to a greenhouse when I was 7. It was hidden in the basement of a warehouse near Pier 54. There were flowers there, lilies that were so dark they looked like velvet. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I had to find the gardener. The gardener? Zayden asked, his eyes narrowing. Thorne's courier was a man named the gardener 10 years ago. He was killed in a raid. No, Nyra said, her heart racing. He didn't mean a person. He meant the statue, the gardener statue in the center of the greenhouse. He told me to look under the 3rd thorn of the black rose. Zayden stood up, his exhaustion replaced by a predatory focus. The warehouse at Pier 54 was burned down 5 years ago, Nyra. It's a ruin. The basement is still there, she insisted. I saw it on the news when the fire happened. The foundation held. Zayden walked to her, his hands coming up to rest on her shoulders. If we go there, Thorne will be waiting. He knows your father's habits better than anyone. It's a trap. Then we make a better trap, Nyra said, surprising herself with the coldness in her own voice. You said you wanted the ledger. You said you wanted to win. Take me to the warehouse. Zayden looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the girl who sold flowers was gone. In her place was someone who had survived a council of monsters and come out with her head held high. You're changing, little son, he whispered, his hand sliding into her hair. The shadows are starting to suit you. I'm just doing what I have to, she said. I want my life back. Your old life is dead, Zayden said, leaning down until their foreheads touched. But if you give me that ledger, I will give you a world where no one can ever hurt you again. I will be your shield. I will be your sword. And who will protect me from you? She asked. Zayden didn't answer. He simply pulled her into a kiss that tasted of whiskey, rain, and the promise of a war that would burn the city to the ground. Nyra closed her eyes, letting herself fall into the darkness of Zayden Sterling. She knew she was making a bargain with the devil, but as she felt his heart beating against hers, she realized she didn't want to be saved by a hero. She wanted to be protected by a monster. The chapter ends as the sirens of the Sterling convoy begin to wail in the courtyard below. The hunt for the Solis ledger is no longer a ghost story. It is a race toward a ruin where the truth is buried under layers of ash and black lilies. Zayden checks his weapon one last time, his silver eyes reflecting the cold moonlight. He looks at Nyra, who is now dressed in black leather and tactical boots, a far cry from the florist she once was. Are you ready? He asks. Yes, I've been ready since the moment I stepped into your car, she replies. The doors open, and they step out into the night, 2 shadows moving through a world of predators, headed toward a destiny that was written in a memory they are both desperate to claim. The ruins of Pier 54 stood like the charred ribcage of a dead leviathan against the grey Seattle shoreline. Once a bustling hub of commerce and salt, it was now a graveyard of rusted cranes and blackened timber, haunted by the screams of gulls and the relentless rhythmic slap of the tide. Zayden Sterling's convoy arrived like a funeral procession of black steel. 3 armored SUVs glided to a halt 100 yards from the warehouse perimeter. The rain had turned into a fine, needle-like mist that clung to everything, making the world look like a faded charcoal sketch. Inside the lead vehicle, Zayden checked the magazine of his customized HKP-30. His movements were mechanical, devoid of hesitation. He looked over at Nyra, who sat beside him. She was dressed in a sleek black tactical jacket he had ordered for her, her pale face framed by the dark collar. She looked fragile, yet there was a new sharpness in her eyes, the look of a woman who had realized that fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. The thermal scans show no movement inside, Zayden said, his voice a low vibration. But Thorn doesn't show up on thermal. He hides in the cold. Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you don't look back. You head for the second SUV. Elias will have the engine running. I'm not running this time, Nyra said, her voice surprisingly steady. She gripped the small flashlight Zayden had given her. I need to see this through. I need to know if my father was the man I loved, or the man you describe. Zayden studied her for a moment. He reached out, his gloved hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her forward until their foreheads touched. He was both, Nyra. That's the tragedy of men like us. We love with one hand and destroy with the other. They stepped out into the biting wind. The air here smelled of salt, rot, and the lingering acrid scent of the fire that had gutted the pier years ago. Zayden's men fanned out, their suppressed rifles raised, sweeping the shadows with infrared beams. The basement entrance should be under the old loading dock, Nyra whispered, pointing toward a collapsed section of the floor where the concrete had buckled. They picked their way through the debris. Every crunch of glass under their boots sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. They reached the loading dock, where a heavy iron hatch lay half buried under a pile of charred pallets. Zayden signaled to two of his men, who stepped forward with crowbars. With a screech of protesting metal, the hatch gave way, revealing a dark stone staircase that descended into the bowels of the pier. Elias, hold the perimeter. No one enters, no one leaves, Zayden commanded. He took the lead, his tactical light cutting a bright, surgical path through the gloom. Nyra followed close behind, her hand instinctively reaching out to grab the back of Zayden's vest. The air grew colder as they descended, thick with the smell of damp earth and something sweet, unnervingly sweet. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a vast, vaulted chamber. It was the basement of the old greenhouse. The glass roof above had long since shattered and been covered by the rubble of the warehouse. But the irrigation pipes remained, hanging from the ceiling like the tangled entrails of a beast. In the center of the room, surrounded by rows of rotted wooden planter boxes, stood the statue. It was a life-sized figure of a man in a hooded robe, leaning on a spade. The stone was stained with soot and moss, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Around the base of the statue, despite the lack of sunlight and the years of neglect, a few twisted dark vines still clung to life. The gardener, Zayden murmured, his light sweeping over the hooded figure. Nyra walked toward it, as if in a trance. Memories flooded back of her father's warm hand in hers, the sound of his laughter echoing in this very room when it was filled with life and colour. He used to tell me that the most beautiful things grew in the dark, she whispered. She reached the statue and knelt at its base. The third thorn of the black rose. She traced her fingers along the stone base, finding a decorative carving of a climbing rose. It was intricate, the petals sharp and realistic. She counted the thorns on the stem. 1, 2, 3. She pressed her thumb against the third thorn. Nothing happened. She pressed harder, putting her weight into it. Click. A small hidden drawer slid out from the pedestal with a dry, rasping sound. Inside lay a single, ancient-looking USB drive encased in a silver locket and a small, leather-bound notebook. Nyra picked them up, her hands trembling. This is it. This is the ledger. Zayden stepped beside her, his shadow looming large against the wall. He reached for the notebook, but before his fingers could touch it, the silence of the basement was shattered. Clap, clap, clap. The sound of slow, rhythmic clapping echoed from the shadows near the far wall. Zayden spun around, his weapon raised in a heartbeat. From the darkness emerged Caliph Thorn. He wasn't alone. A dozen men in tactical gear stepped out behind him, their red laser sights dancing across Zayden's chest and Nyra's face. Thorn looked smug, his thin lips pulled back in a serpentine grin. He held a detonator in his left hand. "I must thank you, Nyra," Thorn purred. "I spent 3 years searching this ruin. I tore down walls, I dug up floors, but I never thought to look under a gardener's rose. I suppose I lacked the sentimental touch." "You're late, Thorn," Zayden said, his voice deathly calm. "My men have the perimeter. You're trapped." "Am I?" Thorn tilted his head. "Look at your radio, Sterling." Zayden glanced at the comms unit on his shoulder. The light was dead. "The signal jammers," Thorn explained. "And as for your men, let's just say I have more resources than you credited me with. Now, be a good businessman and hand over the drive. If you do, I might let the girl live long enough to see the sunrise. As for you, Zayden, I've wanted your head on my desk for a decade. Tonight seems like a fine time to collect." Nyra clutched the drive to her chest. She looked at Zayden. He was a statue of ice, his eyes fixed on Thorn. She realized then that Zayden wasn't looking for a way to negotiate. He was calculating the trajectory of every bullet. "Nyra," Zayden said softly, not breaking eye contact with Thorn. "Remember what I told you in the car?" "You said don't look back," she whispered. "Get ready to run." "Zayden, don't be a fool," Thorn warned, his finger tightening on the detonator. "This entire basement is rigged with C4. One click and we all become part of the Foundation." "I've always liked a grand exit," Zayden replied. In one fluid motion, Zayden reached into his belt and tossed a flashbang grenade toward Thorn's men. Boom! The world turned white. A deafening roar filled the chamber, followed by the chaotic staccato of gunfire. Zayden grabbed Nyra by the waist and dived behind the stone statue just as a hail of bullets chipped the marble above their heads. "Go, the stairs!" Zayden yelled over the noise. He popped up from behind the statue, firing 3 precise shots that dropped 2 of Thorn's guards. Nyra scrambled toward the stairs, her heart screaming in her ears. She heard Thorn's voice through the smoke, high-pitched and furious. "Kill them! Kill them both!" She reached the first few steps of the stone staircase when she looked back. Zayden was pinned down. He was reloading, his movements blurred by speed, but 3 men were flanking him from the left. She couldn't do it. She couldn't leave him. Nyra looked at the heavy iron pipes hanging from the ceiling. They were old, rusted, and held up by crumbling brackets. She saw a manual pressure valve right next to her on the wall, labeled in faded Italian. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if it was water or something else. But she grabbed the iron wheel and turned it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The pipes groaned. A deep, thundering vibration shook the walls. Suddenly, a high-pressure blast of scalding steam and boiling water erupted from the ceiling pipes directly over Thorn's flanking team. The men screamed as they were engulfed in the white cloud, their vision obscured, their skin blistered. Zayden seized the moment. He rolled out from cover, his silver-plated gun barking fire. He took down the remaining guards with the cold efficiency of a machine. Thorn, seeing his men fall, lunged for the shadow of an exit, but Zayden was faster. He fired a shot that caught Thorn in the shoulder, spinning him around. Thorn dropped the detonator. It clattered across the floor, sliding toward a crack in the concrete. Zayden walked toward Thorn, his face a mask of absolute shadow. He kicked the detonator away and pressed the muzzle of his gun against Thorn's forehead. "The war is over, Caliph," Zayden said. "Wait!" Nyra screamed from the stairs. Zayden paused, his finger on the trigger. He looked at Nyra. She was standing there, drenched in steam and sweat, holding the notebook. "If you kill him now, we never find out who the man with the hawk ring is," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber. "The notebook. It mentions a third party, someone who is playing Thorn and my father against each other. If you kill him, That man is still out there. Zayden looked back at Thorn, who was gasping for air, clutching his bleeding shoulder. A flicker of realization crossed Zayden's face. He lowered the gun slightly, but then he used the butt of the weapon to strike Thorn across the temple, knocking him unconscious. "Elias, get down here!" Zayden roared as the comms finally crackled back to life. Within seconds, Sterling's men swarmed the room. They secured Thorn and began clearing the bodies. Zayden walked over to Nyra. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the soot on her face, the tear in her jacket, and the fire in her soul. He reached out and took the notebook from her hand, but he didn't look at it. He looked at her. "You stayed," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a revelation. "You said I was an investment," she replied, her voice trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. "I'm just protecting my interests." Zayden's lips curved into a genuine smile, the first one she had ever seen. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. He smelled of gunpowder, salt, and victory. "The ledger is ours," Zayden whispered into her hair, but the war just got a lot bigger. As they walked out of the ruins of Pier 54, the sun was just beginning to bleed through the grey clouds on the horizon. The first light of dawn hit the silver locket in Nyra's hand. She had found the truth about her father, but in doing so, she had tied herself forever to the man who owned the night. As the convoy drove away from the ash-covered pier, Nyra looked at Zayden, who was already flipping through the notebook with a grim intensity. She realized then that the Solis ledger wasn't just a list of accounts. It was a map of a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the government. And she was no longer the girl who sold flowers. She was Nyra Solis Sterling, the woman who had walked through fire and found that she liked the heat. The Sterling fortress had been transformed from a war room back into a palace of cold glass and silent servants. But the atmosphere had shifted. The air no longer tasted of pure fear. It tasted of a simmering, mutual respect, and a dangerous, unspoken attraction. Nyra stood before a triptych of mirrors in the master suite. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. She wore a gown of liquid midnight, a fabric so dark it seemed to swallow the light, shimmering only when she moved. It was backless, held up by thin silver chains that matched the weight of the sterling diamond at her throat. Her hair was swept up into a sophisticated architectural crown, revealing the sharp line of her jaw. She looked like a queen. She felt like a sacrifice. "You look like you're preparing for an execution," Zayden's voice drifted from the doorway. He was dressed in a bespoke black tuxedo. The white of his shirt was blindingly crisp against the tan of his skin. He looked lethal, polished, and utterly in control. He walked toward her, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. He stood behind her, his large hands coming to rest on her bare shoulders. The heat of his touch sent a jolt through her that she couldn't suppress. "In a way, I am," Nyra whispered, meeting his silver eyes in the glass. "Whose execution is it tonight?" "Tonight, we execute the rumors," Zayden said. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "The city thinks you're a victim. The council thinks you're a pawn. Tonight, you show them you are the Hand of Sterling. We are attending the St. Jude Charity Gala. Every shark in Seattle will be there, including the man with the hawk ring." Nyra froze. "You think he'll show himself?" "He won't be able to resist," Zayden murmured. "He wants the ledger, and since he couldn't get it through Thorn's brutality, he will try to get it through diplomacy. Stay close to me. Smile like you know everyone's secrets and don't drink anything you didn't see poured." "I'm a florist, Zayden, not a spy." Zayden turned her around, his grip tightening slightly. You stopped being a florist the moment you turned that valve at Pier 54. You have fire in you, Nyra. Use it. The Seattle Museum of Art had been hollowed out for the gala. Thousands of white orchids hung from the ceiling, and the floors were covered in plush, crimson carpet. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of expensive perfume. This was where the legitimate side of the city met the shadows, the mayors, the judges, and the CEOs, all clinking glasses with the men who ran the docks and the drug lines. As Zayden and Nyra entered, the room went silent. It was a physical wave of sound cutting off. Zayden didn't lead her in. They walked side by side, an equal front. Every head turned. The whispers started instantly, a low hiss of gossip. Is that her, the Solis girl? Sterling actually brought her? Keep your head up, Zayden signaled under his breath. They were immediately approached by a man who looked like he was made of old parchment and spite. This was Mayor Sterling, no relation, a puppet whose strings were pulled by whoever held the most gold. Zayden! And this must be the enchanting guest we've heard so much about, the mayor chirped, his eyes darting to the diamond on Nyra's neck. Nyra Solis, Zayden introduced her, his voice projecting. My partner. The word partner sent a fresh shockwave through the crowd. In the Mafia world, partner meant someone with the authority to kill in your name. Nyra smiled, a cold, practiced curve of the lips she had rehearsed in the mirror. A pleasure, Mr. Mayor. I believe your re-election campaign was funded by the Sterling Foundation. It's wonderful to see our investments are so visible. The mayor choked on his champagne. Zayden's hand squeezed her waist in silent approval. As they moved through the crowd, Nyra felt like she was navigating a minefield. She was touched, toasted, and inspected by women whose jewelry cost more than her entire neighborhood. She played the part perfectly, using the information she had gleaned from the leather-bound notebook she had spent all afternoon reading. She dropped names of offshore accounts and hinted at regulatory issues whenever someone got too curious. She was becoming a wolf among wolves. Halfway through the night, Zayden was pulled away by a group of investors. Stay with Elias, he whispered, gesturing to his head of security who was disguised as a waiter nearby. I'll be 10 minutes. Nyra wandered toward the balcony, needing a breath of air that didn't smell like hypocrisy. She leaned against the stone railing, looking out at the city. It's a long way down for someone who doesn't know how to fly. Nyra spun around. Standing in the shadows of a large marble pillar was a man she didn't recognize. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a face that was terrifyingly kind. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than Zayden's, and on his right hand, a heavy gold ring glinted. A hawk with its wings spread. Nyra's heart stopped. You. My name is Julian Thorne. No relation to Caliph, I assure you. He was a crude instrument, a hammer where a scalpel was needed. The man stepped into the light. I was your father's employer, and his friend. You were the man who made him run, Nyra spat, her hand instinctively going to the locket hidden beneath her gown. I was the man who kept him alive as long as I could, Julian corrected softly. Your father was a genius, Nyra, but he was weak. He thought he could outsmart the system. The Solis ledger isn't just data, it's the architecture of a new world, and Zayden Sterling isn't the man to build it. He's a destroyer, a warlord. And what are you? I am a gardener, Julian smiled, the same word her father had used. I prune the dead branches so the city can grow. Give me the drive, Nyra. Walk away from Sterling. I have a plane waiting at Boeing Field. I can take you to Switzerland. You can have your flower shop back. A quiet life. No more guns. No more blood. Nyra looked at him. For a split second, the offer was intoxicating. To be normal again. To not have to worry about bullets through the window. Why me? She asked. Because the drive is encrypted with a biometric lock that only your DNA can open, Julian revealed. Your father was clever. He made you the vault. Without you, the data is useless. With you, I am unstoppable. Nyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She wasn't a partner to Zayden, and she wasn't a guest to Julian. She was a key, a biological tool. And if I say no? Julian's smile didn't fade, but his eyes turned as cold as Zayden's. Then the tragedy of Pier 54 will look like a playground accident compared to what happens to this museum tonight. Before Nyra could react, Zayden appeared. He didn't run. He glided. He stepped between Nyra and Julian, his hand already inside his tuxedo jacket. "Julian Vane," Zayden said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "I wondered when you'd stop hiding behind your puppets." "Zayden, you're looking well for a man with a target on his back," Julian replied smoothly. "We were just discussing Nyra's future. It's a shame to waste such talent on a temporary arrangement." "Nyra's future is with me," Zayden said. He turned to Nyra, his eyes searching hers for any sign of betrayal. "Are we done here?" Nyra looked at Julian, then at Zayden. One offered her a lie of a peaceful past. The other offered her the truth of a violent future. She reached out and took Zayden's hand. Her fingers intertwined with his, solid and warm. "We're done." Julian bowed slightly. "A choice has been made. I hope you enjoy the fireworks, Mr. Sterling." As Julian walked away, Zayden grabbed Nyra's arm. "What did he say to you?" "He has the museum rigged," Nyra whispered. "And he told me why you really want me. The biometric lock. You didn't tell me I was the key, Zayden." Zayden's jaw tightened. "I was going to tell you." "When? After you bled me for the data?" "There's no time for this," Zayden hissed, looking at his watch. "Elias, code red, evacuate the East Wing." Suddenly, the lights in the museum flickered and died. A secondary alarm began to blare. Not a fire alarm, but a chemical leak warning. Panic erupted in the ballroom. High society elegance vanished as the guests began to scream and stampede toward the exits. "Stay with me," Zayden roared, pulling a gas mask from a hidden compartment in a decorative bust near the balcony. He pressed it over Nyra's face. "Breathe through this. Don't take it off." A thick, green mist began to pour from the ventilation shafts. It wasn't smoke, it was a neurotoxin. Nyra saw people collapsing around her, clutching their throats. Zayden pulled his gun and fired 3 shots into the glass ceiling. The massive skylight shattered, raining shards of crystal down onto the ballroom, but allowing fresh air to rush in. "The roof! We have to get to the roof!" Zayden shouted. They fought their way against the tide of panicked people. In the chaos, Nyra felt a hand grab her ankle. She looked down and saw a woman in a red dress, her eyes rolling back in her head. Nyra tried to pull her up, but Zayden dragged her away. "You can't save them, Nyra. Move." They reached the service stairs. Men in hawk-crested tactical gear burst through the doors, their suppressed weapons spitting lead. Zayden pushed Nyra behind a concrete pillar and returned fire. He was a whirlwind of violence, moving with a speed that seemed superhuman. He didn't miss. Every shot was a kill. They burst onto the roof. A Sterling helicopter was descending, its searchlights blinding. But across the rooftop, another helicopter was already taking off. Julian Vane stood in the doorway of the retreating aircraft. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He touched his hawk ring to his lips and blew a kiss toward Nyra. The Sterling helicopter touched down. Elias jumped out, helping Nyra inside. Zayden followed, his face covered in soot and blood, his tuxedo ruined. As the helicopter lifted off, Nyra looked down at the museum. It was a tomb of green mist and shattered glass. Hundreds of people were dead or dying, all because she was a key. She pulled off the gas mask and looked at Zayden. He was staring at the retreating Hawk helicopter, his face a mask of absolute rage. "You knew," Nyra said, her voice hollow. "You knew he would do this." Zayden turned to her. The silver in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dark, bottomless void. "I knew he was a monster. I didn't think he'd burn the city's elite to get to you. It means he's desperate. It means the ledger is more powerful than even I imagined." "Is that all you care about?" Nyra screamed over the roar of the rotors. "The data? People died down there." Zayden reached out, grabbing her by the shoulders. He shook her once, hard. "People die every day in this world, Nyra. The only difference is that tonight, they died because of us. You can either mourn them and get us both killed, or you can help me tear Julian Vane's empire apart stone by stone." Nyra looked away, out at the dark horizon. She felt the silver locket against her chest. It felt like a ticking bomb. She realized then that there was no going back. There was no flower shop. There was no Switzerland. There was only the Sterling fortress, the silver-eyed devil beside her, and a war that had just claimed its first 100 victims. "Tell me what I have to do," she said, her voice cold and dead. Zayden leaned back, his hand sliding up to her neck, his thumb tracing the diamond. "Now, we stop playing by their rules. Now we show them why the world is afraid of the name Sterling." As the helicopter disappeared into the clouds, the city of Seattle watched the museum burn, a crimson beacon of a war that was no longer hidden in the shadows. The silence of the Sterling fortress was heavy, a thick shroud that felt more oppressive than the roar of the helicopter. The penthouse was bathed in the flickering orange glow of the fireplace, the only light in a world that had gone dark. Outside the glass walls, the city was a chaotic tapestry of sirens and smoke. The museum was still burning, a funeral pyre for the elite, but up here in the sanctuary of silver and steel, the only sound was the crackle of burning cedar and the ragged breathing of 2 survivors. Zayden Sterling sat on the edge of a black leather sofa, his head bowed. His tuxedo jacket was gone, his white shirt torn and stained with soot and the copper tang of blood, both his and that of his enemies. He looked less like a king and more like a fallen angel, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of the night's casualties. Nyra stood by the window, still in her liquid midnight gown. The silver chains across her back felt like ice. She watched her reflection, a woman she no longer recognized. Her eyes were hollow, her skin smudged with ash. She looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. That was the most terrifying part. She had seen people die in a cloud of green gas, and her hands were steady. "You should get checked by the medics," Nyra said, her voice sounding like it came from a great distance. "They have enough to do with the men who are on the perimeter," Zayden rasped. He didn't look up. He was staring at a deep gash on his forearm, where a shard of the museum's skylight had sliced through muscle. He was trying to tie a makeshift bandage with one hand at his teeth, his jaw clenched in a grimace of pain. Nyra watched him struggle for a moment before her instincts, the ones that used to care for delicate stems and bruised petals, took over. She walked across the room, her silk gown whispering against the floor. "Let me," she said. Zayden froze. He looked up, his silver eyes clouded with a mixture of suspicion and exhaustion. For a heartbeat, the predator was visible, ready to snap. But then, as he looked into Nyra's steady gaze, the tension bled out of him. He dropped the bandage and leaned back, baring his wound to her. Nyra knelt between his knees. The position was intimate, vulnerable. She reached for the first aid kit on the coffee table. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with antiseptic. Zayden didn't flinch, though the sting must have been agonizing. He simply watched her, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to memorize the way the firelight caught the gold in her eyes. "Why didn't you leave with him?" Zayden asked suddenly. Nyra paused, her fingers hovering over his skin. "Julian Vane. He offered me a flower shop in Switzerland. A quiet life." And I realized that a quiet life is just a different kind of grave," Nyra whispered. She looked up at him. "He would have used me to open that drive, and then he would have discarded me. At least with you, I know exactly where I stand. I'm an investment. You don't throw away things you've bled for." Zayden reached out with his good hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, moving upward to brush a smudge of ash from her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she had seen him inflict hours ago. "I didn't just keep you for the data, Nyra," he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough hum. "At first, maybe. But tonight, when I saw Vane talking to you, I felt a rage I haven't felt in a decade. It wasn't about the ledger. It was about the thought of him touching what belongs to me." "I don't belong to anyone," she countered, though the fire in her words lacked its usual sting. "In this city, you do." Zayden stepped closer, metaphorically, his presence filling her senses. "You belong to the side that can keep you alive. And right now, that side is mine. But you're right. You're not a pet. You're the only person in this fortress who looks at me without blinking. Everyone else sees the Sterling name, the money, the monster. You see the scars." He stood up abruptly, pulling his shirt off. Nyra gasped softly. His back and chest were a roadmap of pain, bullet wounds, jagged lines from blades, and the faint, white marks of burns. It was a history of a man who had fought for every inch of ground he owned. "This is the price of the crown, Nyra," he said, turning so she could see the damage. "Every scar is a lesson. Every mark is a person I couldn't save, or a person I had to kill. Do you still want to be a part of this?" Nyra stood up, her hand instinctively reaching out. She didn't touch the scars, but her fingers lingered in the air above them. "I don't think I have a choice anymore. The little son you met in the car is dead, Zayden. You killed her." "I didn't kill her," Zayden said, turning back to face her. He stepped into her space, his heat radiating through the silk of her dress. "I just stripped away the illusions. I showed you the world as it really is. It's dark, it's cold, and the only way to survive is to find someone whose darkness matches yours." He reached out, his hand sliding into the hair at the nape of her neck. He tilted her head back, forcing her to look at him. The silver in his eyes was molten now, a liquid heat that scorched her. "I'm a monster, Nyra. I will burn cities to get what I want. I will use you as a shield if I have to, but I will never lie to you." "Then don't lie to me now," Nyra breathed, her heart racing. "The biometric lock. What happens to me after the drive is open? Does the investment end?" Zayden leaned down, his lips inches from hers. "The drive contains the names of every ghost employee in the Vane network. It's the map to their heart. Once it's open, the war begins in earnest, and I'm going to need a queen who knows how to handle the blood." "A queen," Nyra let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Or a prisoner with a better title." "Does it matter?" Zayden whispered. He crashed his lips onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was an explosion of suppressed tension, hunger, and shared trauma. It tasted of whiskey and the lingering metallic hint of the night's violence. Nyra wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. She needed this raw, grounding heat, to prove that she was still alive, that she hadn't turned into ash at the museum. Zayden groaned, his hands roaming over the curves of her back, the silver chains of her dress biting into his palms. He lifted her easily, her legs wrapping around his waist, and carried her toward the massive bed. In the shadows of the silk hangings, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no Julian vein, no burning museum, no stolen ledger. There was only the friction of skin against skin, the frantic heartbeat of two people who had spent their lives in different types of cages, finally finding a strange, distorted kind of freedom in each other's arms. As the night wore on, the intimacy shifted from desperate to something more profound. Zayden lay with his head on her chest, listening to her heart. He told her things he had never told his captains, about the brother he lost to Thorne's father, about the first time he had to take a life to protect the Sterling line. Nyra told him about her mother's garden, about the way the light hit the pier at 5 in the evening, and about the crushing weight of being a key for a door she never wanted to open. "We're both ghosts, aren't we?" she asked, her voice a whisper in the dark. "We're whatever we need to be to survive the dawn," Zayden replied. Morning came with a cold, grey light that didn't feel like a beginning. Nyra woke up alone in the massive bed. The scent of Zayden, sandalwood and musk lingered on the sheets. She sat up, wrapping a silk robe around herself, and walked to the library. Zayden was already there. He was dressed in a fresh suit, his face a mask of iron once again. He was standing over a high-tech terminal, the silver USB locket from the pier plugged into a port. "It's time," he said, not looking back. Nyra walked to the terminal. A red screen flashed with the words, "Biometric verification required, DNA sequencing." "Are you sure you want to do this?" Nyra asked. "Once this door is open, we can't close it." Zayden turned to her. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, a mix of possessiveness and a strange, flickering sorrow. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles. "The world is already on fire, Nyra. This is just the gasoline." Nyra took a deep breath. She looked at the small needle sensor on the terminal. She pressed her finger against it. A sharp prick. A drop of crimson blood was drawn into the machine. The screen flickered. A series of complex algorithms began to spin. Then, the red turned to a brilliant emerald green. "Access granted." "Welcome, Solis." Files began to cascade down the monitor. Bank accounts, GPS coordinates, ship manifests, and a list of names that made Nyra's blood run cold. At the very top of the list was a file labeled Project Hawk, the Sterling liquidation. Zayden leaned in, his eyes scanning the data with a predatory speed. He was planning to kill us all, not just me, every Sterling, every Vane associate who didn't swear loyalty to him. It wasn't about a debt, it was a coup. But as they scrolled further down, they found a video file. Nyra clicked it. The image was grainy. It showed a man sitting in a dark room. It was her father, Zayden Solis. He looked older, his face haggard. "Nyra," the voice on the recording said, making her gasp. "If you're seeing this, it means you found Zayden Sterling, or he's found you. I'm sorry, my little son. I used you as a vault because you were the only thing in this world that was pure. The ledger isn't just a list of Thorne's crimes. It's the proof that the Sterlings and the Vanes were built on the same lie. They are two sides of the same coin, Nyra. Don't trust the silver eyes. The hawk and the lion are both hunters, and you are the only one who can stop the slaughter." The screen went black. The silence in the library was deafening. Nyra turned to Zayden, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Zayden was staring at the blank screen, his jaw tight. "What lie, Zayden?" she whispered. "What was my father talking about?" Zayden didn't answer. He reached out and pulled the USB drive from the port, clutching it in his fist. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his armor. Not the scars of the past, but a current, bleeding wound. "The lie that keeps us in power," Zayden said, his voice a hollow ghost. "The lie that the Sterlings are the good monsters." Before he could explain, the fortress alarms began to howl once again. Not the perimeter alarm this time, the internal one. Elias burst into the room, his face pale. "Sir, we have a breach in the server room. Someone just uploaded our location to every Thorn sleeper cell in the city. They're coming, Zayden. All of them." Zayden looked at Nyra, then at the drive in his hand. He realized the truth. The ledger wasn't just a weapon for him to use against his enemies. It was a beacon. By opening it, they had screamed their location to the world. "Your father didn't just give us the keys," Zayden said, a dark, grim realization crossing his face. "He gave us a death sentence." He grabbed Nyra's hand, pulling her toward the secret elevator. "The scars were just the beginning, Nyra. Now we find out if we can survive the surgery." As they descended into the darkness of the fortress's escape tunnels, Nyra realized that her father's message was the final blow. In the world of wolves, there was no such thing as healing. There was only the next scar. The Sterling fortress did not fall to an external army. It crumbled from a single, silent stroke of a blade from within. It happened at 2:14 a.m. The internal power grid of the estate, a system designed to withstand a nuclear pulse, shuddered and died. The penthouse was plunged into a terrifying velvet darkness, broken only by the rhythmic, sickly pulse of red emergency lights. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb, just before the stone is rolled into place. "Elias, report!" Zayden's voice cut through the dark, sharp and lethal. He didn't wait for an answer. His hand, calloused and warm, found Nyra's in the shadows. He pulled her behind the solid oak desk in the library, his body a literal shield between her and the door. The air was suddenly thick with the smell of ozone and burnt wiring. "Sir, the firewall has been bypassed physically from the server room." Elias's voice crackled over the comms, but it sounded strange, hollow, devoid of the usual frantic urgency of a soldier under fire. "The primary locks are disengaged. The north and south gates are open, Zayden. All of them." Zayden froze. Nyra felt the muscles in his hand tighten until it was painful. He knew. In that single sentence, he knew the fortress hadn't been breached by Julian Vane's skill, but by his own family's trust. "Nyra, look at me," Zayden whispered, his silver eyes glowing like embers in the red light. He grabbed a compact submachine gun from a hidden compartment beneath the desk and thrust it into her hands. "The safety is off. If anyone who isn't me or Elias enters this room, you aim for the center of the chest. Do not think. Do not hesitate. If you wait to see their face, you're already dead." "Zayden, what's happening?" Nyra gasped, her fingers fumbling with the cold metal of the weapon. "A Judas protocol," Zayden rasped. He didn't have time to explain that it was the code name for an internal coup. He dragged her toward a bookshelf, pulling a leather-bound volume that triggered a hydraulic hiss. A section of the wall slid back, revealing a claustrophobic panic closet lined with monitors. "Stay here. If the monitors go dark, it means they've taken the floor. There is a vent in the ceiling that leads to the service elevator. Only use it as a last resort." He leaned in, his lips crashing against hers in a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation. "I'm coming back for you. Do you hear me? The sun does not set tonight." He pushed her inside and the wall sealed shut. Nyra was trapped in a box of shadows. She pressed her face against the small, reinforced glass slit in the paneling. On the monitors, she watched the slaughter. Men in sterling black were being gunned down in the hallways by tactical teams wearing the Hawk insignia. They moved with a terrifying familiarity, knowing every blind spot, every security camera, every defensive rotation. Then she saw him. Elias walked into the library. He wasn't running. He wasn't bleeding. He moved with a leisurely stride, his weapon lowered. Behind him, stepping over the body of a fallen Sterling guard, was Julian Vane. Zayden stepped out from the shadows of the library balcony, his gun leveled at Elias's head. "I gave you everything, Elias. I gave you my father's legacy. I gave you a seat at my table." Elias stopped, a cold, weary smile touching his lips. "You gave me a seat, Zayden, but you never gave me the crown. You became weak. You fell for a florist with a dead man's secrets, and you put the entire empire at risk for a night in her bed. Julian Vane offers a world where we don't have to hide in fortresses." "He offers you a leash," Zayden spat. "A leash made of gold is still gold," Julian Vane remarked, stepping into the light. He looked around the library with an appraiser's eye. "Where is she, Zayden? Give me the girl, and I might let you live to see what I do with your city." "You'll find her when you're in hell," Zayden growled. The violence that followed was a blur. Zayden moved like a whirlwind, firing with a precision that defied the darkness. He took down 3 of Vane's men in heartbeats, but he was one man against a tide of betrayal. A flashbang exploded in the center of the room. Nyra screamed behind the wall as the monitors hissed into static. The concussion shook the very foundations of the room. When the smoke cleared, she saw through the glass slit that Zayden was on his knees, his shoulder shattered by a bullet, his silver eyes clouded with pain. Elias stood over him, the muzzle of his pistol pressed against Zayden's temple. "Come out, Nyra," Julian Vane's voice boomed, echoing in the small panic room. "I know you're in the wall. I helped your father design this wing 10 years ago. If you don't step out in 5 seconds, Elias will decorate this carpet with Zayden's brains." Nyra didn't hesitate. She couldn't. She triggered the release and stepped out, the submachine gun heavy in her hands. She pointed it at Julian, her eyes burning with a hatred she didn't know she was capable of. "Let him go," she hissed. Julian laughed, a dry, papery sound. "Look at you. From lilies to lead. You really are your father's daughter. But put the toy down, Nyra. You haven't even cleared the chamber." He gestured to the shadows. 4 more men emerged, their red laser sights dancing across Nyra's heart. "The deal, Julian," Zayden choked out, blood coughing from his lungs. "You take her. You let my men live. You leave the house." "The deal is whatever I say it is," Julian replied, walking toward Nyra. He reached out and gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. "The ledger is open, the data is flowing, but I still need the key for the final vault. The DNA sequence for the offshore liquidations. You're coming with me, Nyra. Not as a guest, but as a prisoner of war." Elias grabbed Nyra's arms, wrenching the gun from her hands and pinning her against his chest. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but he was a mountain of muscle. "Zayden!" she shrieked. Zayden tried to lunge forward, but a guard kicked him in the ribs, sending him sprawling across the floor. Julian Vane looked down at the broken King of Seattle with a look of pure, unadulterated pity. "Burn it," Vane commanded, turning toward the door. "Burn the fortress. Leave him in the ash." As they dragged Nyra towards the balcony where a Vane helicopter was already hovering, its rotors whipping the rain into a frenzy, she saw the first incendiary grenades go off. The silk curtains caught fire. The ancient books, the history of the Sterling family, began to curl and blacken. "Zayden!" she screamed one last time as she was shoved into the helicopter. Through the window she saw him. Zayden had crawled to the edge of the balcony, his hand outstretched toward the sky, his silver eyes fixed on the disappearing aircraft. He wasn't dead. He was watching his world be stolen from him. The fire reflected in his eyes, making them look like molten metal. The helicopter lifted off, banking hard over the jagged cliffs. Nyra looked down. The Sterling fortress, her golden cage, her sanctuary, was a blooming flower of orange and red fire against the black Pacific night. She collapsed onto the floor of the helicopter, her emerald dress torn, the black diamond on her neck feeling like a brand of shame. Julian Vane sat across from her, calmly wiping a drop of rain from his hawk ring. He was a magnificent distraction, wasn't he? But now the real work begins. You're going to help me rewrite the world, Nyra Solis, whether you want to or not. Nyra didn't cry. The tears had been burnt out of her. She stared at the floorboards, her mind repeating the last look in Zayden's eyes. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't even pain. It was a promise of a reckoning. Somewhere in the burning ruins behind them, the monster had been unleashed. Zayden Sterling had lost his empire, his house, and his men. All he had left was his wrath. And as the helicopter flew into the heart of the storm toward Vane's private island, Nyra knew that the man she loved would either come for her, or he would turn the entire world into a graveyard trying. "I'm going to kill you," Nyra whispered, looking up at Julian Vane. Julian smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. "I certainly hope you try, my dear. It makes the victory so much sweeter." The ruins of the Sterling fortress did not smell of luxury anymore. They smelled of scorched marble, melted plastic, and the metallic, cloying scent of a massacre. Zayden Sterling pushed a blackened beam off his chest, the effort forcing a ragged, bloody cough from his throat. His charcoal suit was a tattered rag, his skin was mapped with new burns, and his left shoulder was a numb, wet mess of lead and bone. He should have been dead. By every law of biology and ballistics, the King of Seattle should have been a corpse in the ash. But Zayden Sterling was not fueled by blood anymore. He was fueled by a cold, crystalline rage that had turned his veins to liquid nitrogen. He staggered to the edge of the balcony, clutching a jagged piece of rebar for support. Below, the sirens of the city were finally approaching. But they were too late. They were always too late. He looked out at the dark horizon where the Vane helicopter had disappeared. His silver eyes, normally sharp and calculating, were now wide and terrifyingly vacant, the eyes of a man who had already seen his own funeral and decided he wasn't finished. "Sir?" Zayden turned slowly. A figure emerged from the smoke of the lower levels. It was Marcus, the elderly butler. He was bleeding from a head wound, clutching a tactical shotgun. He was the only one left. "Marcus," Zayden rasped, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. "The secondary armory, is it intact?" "The floor collapsed, sir, but the basement vault, the one your father built for the end of days, it held." "Good." Zayden took a shaky step, then another. The pain was a distant scream he chose to ignore. "Get the adrenaline from the med bay, then get the keys to the interceptor." "Sir, you're in no condition to—" Zayden gripped Marcus's shoulder, his fingers digging into the old man's skin. "They took her, Marcus. They took the only thing that made me feel like a man instead of a ghost. I'm not going there to bring her back. I'm going there to ensure that by sunrise, the name Vane is nothing but a footnote in a history book written in blood." 30 minutes later, the Interceptor, a reinforced matte black speedboat powered by twin turbine engines, tore through the choppy waters of Puget Sound. Zayden sat at the helm, his shoulder crudely stapled shut and pumped full of high-grade military stimulants. He wore a black tactical vest, and a specialized long-range rifle was strapped to his back. He didn't need an army. An army was slow, An army was loud. He was a shadow returning to the dark. The Vane stronghold was a fortress of glass and steel built on a private island 10 miles off the coast. It was guarded by 3 tiers of security: naval patrols, automated turrets, and 60 of Julian Vane's most loyal hounds. Zayden didn't slow down as he approached the jagged rocks of the island's northern face. Instead, he jammed the throttle to its limit and bailed out of the boat seconds before it slammed into the Vane patrol pier. Boom! The explosion was a magnificent distraction. While the guards rushed toward the flaming wreckage of the boat, Zayden was already scaling the sheer cliff face on the opposite side of the island. His fingers bled as they clawed into the wet basalt. But he felt nothing. He reached the top, rolled over the railing of the perimeter fence, and drew his silver-plated handgun. The silence of the night was shattered by the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of a suppressed weapon. Zayden moved through the gardens, the very gardens Julian Vane had boasted about, like a scythe through wheat. He didn't fire twice. He didn't miss. Every guard that crossed his path was a dead man before they could even draw a breath. He reached the main villa. Inside, the lights were bright, a mocking contrast to the carnage outside. In the heart of the villa, Nyra Solis was strapped into a high-tech medical chair. A series of tubes were connected to her arm, feeding her blood into a sequencing machine. Julian Vane stood over the monitor, watching the progress bar of the encryption bypass. 92%, Julian murmured. Almost there, Nyra. Once the funds are transferred, you'll be the richest orphan in the world. For about 5 minutes. Then I'm afraid your key will be retired. Nyra looked at him, her face pale but her gaze unbroken. He's coming for you. Julian laughed, a dry, hollow sound. Zayden is ash, my dear. Elias saw him collapse. No one survives an incendiary blast at that range. You don't know him, Nyra whispered. He doesn't stay dead when he's angry. Suddenly, the lights in the lab flickered. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the floorboards. The security monitors on the wall began to flicker into static. What is that? Julian snapped, turning to Elias, who stood by the door. Elias checked his radio. Sir, we've lost contact with the perimeter. The turrets are offline. Someone has uploaded a Sterling virus into the central... The heavy steel doors of the lab were suddenly ripped off their hinges by a directional explosive. The shockwave threw Elias across the room and sent Julian stumbling into the equipment. Through the smoke and the dust, a silhouette appeared. Zayden Sterling stepped into the room. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a demon forged in the fires of his own home. His silver eyes were glowing with a terrifying, cold light. His shirt was soaked in blood, but he held his rifle with a steady, lethal hand. Zayden, Nyra breathed, tears of relief and terror streaming down her face. Elias scrambled to his feet, reaching for his weapon, but Zayden was faster. He didn't use the rifle. He lunged across the room, his movement a blur of predatory speed. He slammed Elias into the wall, his hand crushing the traitor's throat. I gave you my trust, Zayden hissed, his face inches from Elias's, and you traded it for a seat at a table that's about to be burned. With a sickening crack, Zayden snapped Elias's neck. He let the body drop like a sack of unwanted coal. Julian Vane backed away, reaching for a small remote on his belt. Stay back, Sterling. One button and this whole lab goes up. You'll kill her. Zayden didn't stop. He walked toward Julian, his boots clicking on the sterile floor. He ignored the gun Julian pulled from his waistband. You think I care about the explosion? Zayden asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. I've already walked through fire tonight, Julian. I'm comfortable in the heat. But you've lived your whole life in air-conditioned rooms, playing with other people's lives. Let's see how you handle the reality of a Sterling debt. Julian fired. The bullet grazed Zayden's cheek, drawing a line of red. Zayden didn't even flinch. He reached out and grabbed Julian's gun arm, twisting it until the bone splintered through the skin. Julian screamed, a high-pitched, pathetic sound. Zayden shoved the rifle barrel into Julian's mouth, silencing the scream. "You took my house. You took my men. You took her," Zayden whispered, leaning in. "But the ledger told me the truth, Julian. My father didn't build a lie. He built a trap, and you just walked right into it." Nyra watched as Zayden's finger tightened on the trigger. But then she saw the monitors. "Zayden, wait!" she screamed. "Look at the screen." The sequencing was at 100%, but instead of a bank transfer, a different file had opened. A video began to play on every screen in the lab. It wasn't her father. It was a younger Julian Vane and Zayden's father, sitting together in a dark room 30 years ago. "The project is complete," Zayden's father said on the recording. "The Solis girl will be the vault, but we must ensure that our sons never find out. If the Sterling and Vane families ever unite through her, the council will be dismantled. We have to keep them at war. Always." The truth was a cold blade to the heart. The war between their families, the blood, the deaths, it had all been a scripted play by their fathers to keep the council's power intact. Nyra's father hadn't been a victim. He had been the architect of a conflict designed to outlive him. Zayden froze. He looked at the screen, then back at Julian Vane. The man he had hated his entire life wasn't his enemy. He was a fellow pawn in a game played by dead men. Julian looked at the screen, his eyes wide with horror. They played us. Both of us. Zayden lowered the rifle. The rage was still there, but it was redirected. He looked at Nyra, who was still strapped into the chair. He moved to her, his hands trembling as he tore the tubes from her arm and shattered the restraints. "Nyra," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. She held him, her face buried in his blood-stained chest. "It's over, Zayden. The lie is over." "No," Zayden said, looking up at the ceiling. "It's just beginning. They wanted us to be enemies because they knew that together we could burn their whole world down." He turned back to Julian Vane. The man was whimpering on the floor, clutching his broken arm. Zayden didn't kill him. Not yet. "You're going to help us, Julian," Zayden said, his silver eyes returning to their cold, calculated state. "You're going to use your remaining resources to call a meeting of the council. All of them, in one room." "Why?" Julian gasped. Zayden looked at Nyra, then back at the burning horizon of the city. He reached down and picked up the silver USB drive from the sequencer. "Because a Sterling always collects his debts," Zayden said, "and the council owes us 30 years of blood." Zayden carried Nyra out of the lab, leaving Julian Thorne broken on the floor. As they walked out onto the balcony of the villa, the sun was just beginning to rise over the Pacific. It wasn't a peaceful dawn, it was a crimson sunrise, the color of the war that was about to come. Nyra looked at Zayden. He was covered in blood, his empire was gone, and the man he thought was his father had betrayed him from the grave. But as he held her hand, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just wrath, it was a purpose. "We're going to burn it all, aren't we?" Nyra asked. Zayden looked at her, and for the first time he leaned down and kissed her softly, a promise of a new kind of world. "No, little son," Zayden whispered. "We're going to build something better on the ash." As the Vane helicopter, now under Zayden's control, lifted off the island, the villa below exploded in a spectacular bloom of fire. Zayden and Nyra sat together in the cabin, two broken souls who had finally found the truth in the dark. The wrath of Sterling was no longer a blind rage. It was a targeted strike at the heart of the system that had created them. and as they flew toward the city, the residents of Seattle looked up at the sky, unaware that the king and queen of the shadows were coming home to claim their throne. The summit of the council was held not in a dark basement, but in the most transparent place in Seattle, the Sky Lounge of the Zenith Tower, encased in 360 degrees of reinforced glass. It was a cruel irony. The 12 men and women who pulled the strings of the city's underworld sat around a circular table of white marble, sipping vintage scotch, while the world below moved like ants, unaware that their lives were being traded like commodities. They called themselves the Founders, but they were merely leeches with better tailors. At the head of the table sat Madame Vesper, a woman whose face was a masterpiece of plastic surgery and cold indifference. She tapped a diamond-encrusted pen against the marble. "Julian Vane is late," she noted, her voice like dry parchment. "And Zayden Sterling's fortress is a smoking crater. The Solis ledger is missing. This instability is bad for the margins." "The Sterling boy is dead." Another council member, a shipping tycoon named Holloway, grunted. "My sources saw the blast. We should move to liquidate the remaining Sterling assets by dawn." "I wouldn't be so quick to sign those papers, Holloway." The voice didn't come from the doorway. It came from the speakers of the room. The lights in the Sky Lounge flickered, then shifted from a warm amber to a piercing, clinical silver. The elevator doors at the far end of the hall chimed. They slid open to reveal a sight that should have been impossible. Zayden Sterling walked into the room. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been tailored for a god of war. His left arm was in a black silk sling, but his right hand held a silver-plated detonator. Behind him, draped in a gown of shimmering gold that looked like woven sunlight, walked Nyra Solis. She wasn't the trembling girl from the flower shop. She was a vision of vengeance, her eyes steady, her hand resting on the hilt of a small, ornate dagger at her waist. The council members scrambled to their feet, chairs screeching against the polished floor. "Zayden?" Vesper gasped, her composure finally cracking. You should be Ash." "I get that a lot," Zayden said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to rattle the glass walls. He walked to the head of the table, pulling out the chair that had been reserved for Julian Vane. He didn't sit. He stood, looming over them, while Nyra took the seat beside him. "You've had a busy 30 years, Zayden continued, placing the Solis ledger, the silver USB drive, on the marble table. "Manipulating my father. Manipulating the Vanes. Turning our families into attack dogs so you could sit up here in your glass cage and count your percentages." "You don't know what you're talking about, boy," Holloway hissed, reaching for a silent alarm button under the table. "Don't," Nyra said softly. "The alarm system is currently playing a loop of my father's final confession to every news outlet in the Pacific Northwest, along with the bank account numbers of every person at this table." The room went deathly silent. "What have you done?" Vesper whispered, her face turning a sickly shade of grey. "I've opened the vault," Nyra replied, leaning forward. "My father was a gardener, Vesper. He knew that if you want to get rid of weeds, you don't just cut the tops. You poison the soil. The Solis ledger wasn't just a list of crimes. It was a kill switch for the entire council infrastructure." Zayden tapped the detonator. "Every server you own, every offshore shell company, every hidden warehouse, they're currently being deleted or redirected to federal seizure accounts. By the time the sun fully rises, you won't be the Founders. You'll be the most wanted fugitives in the world with $0 to buy your way out." "You're destroying yourself too, Sterling," Holloway roared. "The Sterling name is tied to these accounts. You'll go down with us." Zayden smiled. It was a cold, beautiful, and utterly terrifying expression. "The Sterling name died in the fire at the fortress. I'm just a ghost now, and ghosts don't care about jail cells." Zayden leaned over the table, his silver eyes locking onto Vesper's. "Julian Vane is in the lobby, by the way, or what's left of him. He was very talkative once I showed him the video of his father and mine. He realized the same thing I did, that you are the real disease." "Security!" Vesper screamed, finally losing her nerves. The double doors burst open. A dozen tactical guards in black gear rushed in, weapons raised. The council members smirked, thinking the tide had turned. "Kill them," Vesper commanded, pointing at Zayden and Nyra. The guards didn't fire. They didn't even aim at Zayden. They fanned out around the room, their weapons pointed directly at the council members. Zayden straightened his suit jacket. "Did you really think the men who bleed for you would stay loyal once they realized their paychecks were bouncing? These men work for the highest bidder, and right now, the highest bidder is the woman holding the Solis inheritance." Nyra stood up, her gold gown catching the first rays of the dawn breaking over the Puget Sound. "The age of shadows is over. You used our fathers to build a wall of blood. We're using that blood to drown you." "What do you want?" Vesper asked, her voice trembling. "I want you to watch," Zayden said. He turned to the glass wall. Below in the city, the first plumes of smoke were rising, not from bombs, but from the burning of council records. The digital apocalypse was happening in real time. Zayden walked over to Nyra. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. They stood together at the edge of the world, looking down at the empire they had just dismantled. "The police will be here in 10 minutes, Zayden said to the council without turning around. "I suggest you use that time to pray, although I doubt anyone is listening to people like you." The escape was silent. While the city erupted into a frenzy of sirens and news helicopters, Zayden and Nyra descended the private elevator to the basement garage. A single nondescript black SUV was waiting. Marcus was at the wheel, his head bandaged but his eyes bright. "The plane is fueled, sir. Destination." Zayden looked at Nyra. For the first time in his life, he didn't have a plan. He didn't have a fortress to return to, or a throne to sit on. He was a man with nothing but a name, and the woman beside him. "Where do you want to go, Nyra?" he asked. Nyra looked at the black diamond around her neck. She reached back, unclipped the silver chain, and handed the jewel to Marcus. "Sell this. Use the money to rebuild the flower shops on Pier 54. Make sure the families of the men we lost are taken care of." Then she looked at Zayden. "I want to go somewhere the sun actually reaches the ground. Somewhere where we aren't keys or kings." Zayden nodded to Marcus. "The Mediterranean, a small island, one without a name." As the SUV sped away from the Zenith Tower, Nyra leaned her head on Zayden's shoulder. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, but also a strange lightness of spirit. "Is it really over?" she whispered. "The war is over," Zayden said, kissing the top of her head. "But the world is going to be very loud for a while. They'll be looking for us." "Let them look," Nyra said, closing her eyes. "They're looking for a monster and a victim. They won't find either of them." 6 months later, the village of Positano sat like a cluster of pastel jewels against the rugged Italian cliffs. The air smelled of lemon trees, salt air, and blooming bougainvillea. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the ghosts of the past were drowned out by the rhythmic pulse of the Tyrrhenian Sea. At the edge of the village, a small cottage stood overlooking the water. It had a sprawling garden filled not with expensive orchids or rare hybrids, but with simple, vibrant wildflowers. A woman sat in the dirt, her hands stained with soil, her hair tied back in a messy knot. She was humming a soft tune, a song her mother used to sing while planting lilies. "The soil here is too dry," a deep voice said from the terrace. Nyra looked up and smiled. Zayden was leaning against the stone archway, dressed in a simple white linen shirt and dark trousers. He looked younger. The hard lines of his face had softened, and the silver in his eyes no longer looked like cold metal. They looked like the reflection of the sea. He walked down into the garden, kneeling beside her. He reached out and took a small trowel, helping her dig a hole for a new sapling. "I like the challenge," Nyra said, wiping a smudge of dirt from her forehead. "Things that grow in difficult places are always the strongest." Zayden looked at her, his gaze lingering on the faint scar on her shoulder, a reminder of the night at the museum. He reached out and touched it gently. "We grew, didn't we?" "We survived," she corrected. They sat in the garden together, the king of shadows and the flower girl, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. In the distance, a small radio on the terrace was playing the news in Italian. It spoke of the ongoing trials in America, of the collapse of the founders, and of the mysterious disappearance of Zayden Sterling, who was presumed dead in a boating accident off the coast of Italy. Zayden reached over and switched the radio off. "The world thinks we're dead, Nyra," he said, pulling her into his lap. "Good," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Let them have the ghosts. I'd rather have this." Zayden leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was no longer desperate or filled with the scent of gunpowder. It was a kiss of peace, of a promise kept, and of a future they had bought with their own blood. As the sun dipped below the water, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the dawn of Solis finally arrived. It wasn't a dawn of power or of ledgers, but a dawn of freedom. The Sterling name was gone. The Solis secret was buried. But in a small garden on a cliffside halfway across the world, something new was beginning to bloom. It was fragile, it was beautiful, and for the first time in their lives, it belonged to no one but them. Zayden looked at Nyra, the woman who had taught a monster how to see the light, and he knew that no matter what shadows might one day return, they would never be able to touch the sun again. "I love you, Nyra," he whispered into the twilight. "I know," she replied, her eyes shining with a brilliance that outshone any diamond. "You've been showing me since the day you bought those lilies." The darkness had finally been defeated, not by a sword, but by the simple act of choosing to walk into the light. 5 years after the collapse of the council, the small island off the Amalfi coast was no longer a refuge for ghosts. It had become a true sanctuary. The ancient stone villa was no longer surrounded by electric fences or armed sentries, but by vibrant cascades of bougainvillea and trees heavy with lemons. Zayden Sterling, the man who once commanded the underworld with an iron fist, now stood on the veranda. His silver eyes, once as cold as a winter blade, were now uncharacteristically warm as he looked down at the lawn. "Leo, not so fast! You'll ruin your mother's flowers," Zayden called out, his voice deep but laced with tenderness. A young boy of about 4 with dark hair and the unmistakable silver-grey eyes of the Sterling line was frantically chasing a yellow butterfly. The boy skidded to a halt, flashing a brilliant smile, the same sunlight smile that Zayden had first fallen for in Nyra. "But I want to catch it for Mama, Papa," Leo shouted, his small legs already resuming their sprint across the beds of lavender. Nyra emerged from the back garden, her arms cradling a bunch of wild sunflowers. She no longer wore liquid silk gowns or heavy black diamonds. Instead, she wore a simple, white linen dress, her feet bare on the grass, looking more radiant and alive than ever before. "Let the butterfly go, Leo," Nyra laughed, catching her son as he tumbled into her arms. "Real beauty is found when things are free, just like our family." Zayden walked down the stone steps, wrapping his arms around both of them. He pressed a kiss to Nyra's forehead and ruffled his son's hair. This feeling, the warmth of skin, the scent of earth and blooms, and the laughter of a child, was something that 5 years ago he never would have dared to dream of. "There was a letter from Marcus today," Zayden whispered into Nyra's ear. "Everything in Seattle has settled. The flower shops at Pier 54 are thriving. The Solis Foundation has helped thousands of children. The names Sterling and Solis are remembered now as builders, not destroyers." Nyra looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with happiness. "I knew you could do it. You turned the shadows into light." "It wasn't me," Zayden murmured, his gaze resting on Leo, who was currently trying to stuff a flower into his father's pocket. "It was you. You gave me a reason to be a man worthy of this world." That evening, as the sun began to dip below the Mediterranean, staining the world in shades of crimson and gold, the three of them sat on the cliffside. Leo sat between his father and mother, listening intently as Zayden told stories of great ships and distant oceans, leaving out, of course, the bloodier details. Zayden looked down at his hands, hands that had once been stained with blood, now holding the small hand of his son and the soft hand of his wife. He realized that his greatest victory wasn't defeating the council or seizing the ledger. It was building a fortress where the only weapon was love. "Papa," Leo looked up at Zayden, "when I grow up, will I be a warrior like you?" Zayden smiled, the most peaceful expression of his life. He lifted the boy onto his shoulders, facing the brilliant horizon. "You will be a protector, Leo. But you won't fight for hatred. You will fight to protect your mother's flowers, to protect this peace. You are our dawn." As night fell, the small island was bathed in a serene silence. Inside the cottage, warm yellow light spilled from the windows. The past, the gunshots, the explosions, and the betrayals had receded, leaving only the future stretching out like the calm sea before them. Beneath a large oak tree in the corner of the garden, a small, modest plaque was placed. It bore no names, only the engravings of a rose and the wings of a hawk. It was where they remembered what was lost, to better cherish what they now possessed. Zayden and Nyra stood by the window, watching their son sleep soundly in his crib. They were no longer pawns on someone else's chessboard. They were the authors of their own story. "The sun has set," Nyra whispered, leaning her head on Zayden's shoulder. "But it will always rise again," Zayden replied, pulling her close. "Because now we are each other's light."